everyone, and welcome to today's Catalyst Story session, Pitching in the Zoom Age. I'm your host and director of Catalyst Story Institute, Nikki Coble, and our guest today is Jason Kyle. Jason is a TV developer at Major Studios and the co-founder of the Creators Writing Room with Lee Aronsohn, who you will know as the co-creator of Two and a Half Men, executive producer of Big Bang Theory, where they focus on empowering up-and-coming creators with industry knowledge and expertise. Welcome, Jason.
What a great voice. A great cadence, a great voice, a great delivery. It makes me very jealous, and I'm happy
Thank
to be
you.
here.
Thank you for being here. And just for those who may not know, let's start out with an overview. What are some of the ways a creator might land a meeting with someone like you?
Oof, someone like me. I don't know if they want to meet someone like me. It depends on how we're defining that. But I think, if we're talking about in the context of like pitching a show, generally that goes through channels of representation, like legally. Even like Lee and I have a show that we're developing right now. If somebody wanted to send something to us, so like, hey, would you guys be interested in developing this with us? Like legally, we can't accept those submissions unless it's legally submitted through like representation,
Mhm.
because I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but it has something to do with like if you have an idea and it's similar to their idea that nobody wants to get sued. It rarely happens when ideas are stolen, but that's why you always hear you need representation, and that's why that's important. I think networking is another really important aspect of this business. Like I do a lot of stuff, free Zoom shows online, like live Q&As, and we have a social media presence. And I can tell when people are always coming back, always asking questions, engaging with the community. Like that's another way to kind of just like get on somebody's radar. And I mean, we have people who work full time for CWR now who got those positions by doing exactly what I just said, by showing they offer this value, by engaging in the community and asking questions and wanting to learn and wanting to help. And those are great ways to kind of get noticed in the community
Mhm.
without, because we get this all the time. We get people just asking flat out, like, can I pitch you my show? Or just unsoliciting sending an unsolicited pitch or script. And it's just like,
Mhm.
that's not really the way to go about it. Again, there's the legal ramifications, but also like, I don't know. I don't know you. I don't
Right.
know who this person is. Like, so, I don't know. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, it's just very important that there's some context, right? Even if it's that my lawyer has worked with you on a different
Yes.
show through a different
Yes.
artist, you're looking to do the research to make the connections so that we're one, whatever the 6 degrees of separation is, we're one more degree closer than we were as strangers with me just trying to send
Right.
something in the mail to you.
Right.
That makes
Yeah, if
sense.
there's if find a common denominator, to reach out. I mean, people reach out on LinkedIn all the time to me just to say, "Hey, like, we were on co-pilots with you and Lee last night. It was great. Thank you so much for doing that." Like, not asking for anything, just showing like their support, and I'll always write back and saying, "Hey, thanks for being there." Like that is just like a easy way of establishing some type of like rapport or connection with someone.
Mhm.
But yes, if you could find a common denominator, hey, I worked with so and so told me to reach out, like that's always a great way to do it.
And planting those seeds, I think it's also important to remember that they develop over time. First time I talk to you should be about, hey, that was so great, thank you so much. And
Hmm.
another time I might, have another interaction as opposed to, hi, it's nice to meet you. So since we're talking, can you look at my show? It's not the
Yeah,
best way to
yeah,
lead.
yeah. That's always tricky, and I talk about this a lot. Of like when you want to ask someone for something, um,
Mhm.
there's no like hard and fast rule around that. You essentially have to feel it out, but you definitely don't want to do it right away. What I always suggest people doing is, if I know that there's somebody who can help me in the industry do something, I'm thinking about, well, what value can I offer to them?
Mhm.
So maybe it is an initial introduction. Maybe it's, hey, I know so and so that and then you start to develop a little bit of a rapport, and there's some back and forth, and then it's, hey, I would love to offer this for you. A couple of
Right.
people reach out to us saying like, hey, we'd love to intern for you for free through CWR, or help you run your Zoom shows, and already that offers value for us. And if we say okay, if we need it and they do a good job, then it's like, okay, well, let's continue this. Again, we have paid positions with CWR where people have done exactly that. So
Right. Right. Not a one-way street. Always be thinking
Mhm.
of what you could offer and making it a genuine interaction. What are the
Absolutely.
overall objectives from your side of the table when you do meet with someone? Of course, there are different types of meetings, different types of reasons we could meet, but what end up being your objectives?
Yeah. So let's break that down in a couple of different sort of like categories. Like if we're meeting with someone in terms of a general meeting to meet a writer for the first time, we want to get a sense of just who this person is, what their personality is like. Um, Probably by this point, we've already read their sample and their material and their bio. So it's like, okay, we know they can write. That's great. Let's meet them and see if they are a really important part, good to work with.
Mhm.
Because when you're a writer trying to break in, you really need to do, and if you want a long-term career, you need three things, which is to be good on the page with your writing, with your samples, to be good in a room in terms of generals and pitching, and to be good to work with. And that third one is really tough to acquire if you're already not a good person. So that's really what those general meetings are for, is to get a sense of, do I vibe with this person? Do I want to work with them X amount of hours a day, X amount of weeks during a year?
Mm.
Um, uh, Similar things go for the pitch if someone's pitching us a show or an idea, but we get a little bit more specific around what's the character, what's the emotional connection to this piece. So that's something that we look for on that side of the table. I'm trying to think. And, I'll just say, on the CWR front, if we're hiring someone, it's, also, are they good to work with? But what is like, is there a technical expertise that they have? Because a lot of what we do now is digital. I know we're going to be talking about pitching over Zoom. So how good are you at Zoom with graphics, with video editing, like all of these, like some deep technical expertise that we might look for? Um, as well as just like, what is your longer term vision in this industry? Like, what is it you want to do? And how is this going to get you eventually to where you want to be? Um, you know, there are a few people out there who want to be like assistants or coordinators or even managers for like the rest of their career. Like they want to, a lot of times people have ambition to move up and produce and do this and that. So I feel like having that conversation of like, what is the path that you're working towards gives us a sense of like, okay, is this the right fit? Are they going to learn what they need to learn? Or is it something they're just like looking for in short term and trying to jump ship? So,
Mhm. And the clarity of that path is so important too, because I think a lot of times, especially when we're younger and we're trying to just get ahead somewhere,
mhm,
you want to do all the things. And it
right,
doesn't help anyone help you
right,
unless you've done that work to get clear on what you'd like,
right.
where you'd like to be ultimately, right?
Yeah. And I
Of
think,
course.
not knowing or not having a clear, like here's one of the things. Now look, I'm getting way too philosophical in like our education system. But like I feel like we have to figure out what it is we want to do very early on at a very young age. Like major in something in college, then maybe go get a master's in it and then like get a job in that field. And then by the time you know it, it's kind of like, yeah, I don't know if I like this. So that in itself is okay. I think if you are involved in the entertainment industry somehow and knowing like, okay, I want to be in front of the camera or I want to be behind the camera or I might want to either independently produce or one day become a studio executive. Like you're starting to narrow in on what that ultimate goal is. So, again, if it's not a specific thing, kind of knowing at least a direction you want to go to, you can always try something out. If it's not a fit, you pivot.
Mhm. Mhm. And what about if you are reading my materials and it's not just a general, this is about going forward with an actual project. What are your goals
Mhm.
then?
So, meaning if we read somebody's sample and they say, "Hey, I have a project I want to pitch you," and
Mhm.
then we come in and bit. So, really, what we're looking for there is, some of these key things that people probably hear all the time, but I'll break them down in terms of what they mean. Part of it is like the why now and the why you, which I sort of bundle in terms of like the emotional connection. What's your
Mhm.
emotional connection to this piece? AKA, why are you the one that has to write this? Is there a certain lived experience? Is there a certain specific common denominator that you have with the story, with the themes, with the character that says, wow, Nikki is the only one who could really truly write this story from this specific point of view with her unique voice, right? So we're
Mhm.
getting very specific on all of those things as opposed to just a general, like, this is an action show where like people are shooting each other back and forth. And I'm like, okay, like I don't, we've seen those before, but like, what is the specificity and the emotional connection around that? Which kind of leads into like the why now. Why is this something original? Is this something different? Is it something we haven't seen before? Is it a different take, a different point of view? Those are all things we look for like right away. And then it goes into character. Like, why are these, or why is this such a fascinating, compelling character that we have to watch them week after week or episode after episode? A lot of times people get hung up in the plot of the show, which is not that relevant at all. Like a story, of course, needs to have a plot, but there are only so many plots. What we are really engaged by is who the character is, what do they want, and what are they wanting to do to get it. So those are the things that we really look for. And then the third thing I'll say is the pilot. What's the beginning, middle, and end? Is there sort of a journey or an arc that our protagonist goes on that we can say, okay, this is what the engine of the show is. I'm willing to watch episode 2, 3, 4.
Making sure that it's compelling enough that you're hooked in the room, thus the audience would also be hooked. How has working remotely affected the actual pitch meeting process?
Oh boy.
I mean, has it? Have you noticed? Is it weird?
I kind of got so at the first studio I started working at, that was a couple years pre-pandemic, and was introduced to the in-person pitching. And it was, the pacing was slower. People would come onto the studio lot and do some small talk, and we just, like, I always just thought, okay, this is the natural process. But then when we pivoted to Zoom during the pandemic, things changed very quickly, and I think very things changed in terms of the amount of time and the visual aspect of a pitch. So I'll explain. Over during the Zoom age, we're allowed to share our screen. Also, given the fact that we're working from home on Zoom in front of our computers, have a number of different distractions. Nobody else is really around us. We're by ourselves. It's very easily to get your focus pulled into something else. It's like, oh, my cat's jumping around. Oh, it's like this person's texting me. Well, I texted them a week ago, and now they decided to text me back. Now I don't know if I'm going to write back. Now I'm disengaged in the pitch. Like, I don't know what's going on. So we need to find ways to keep people really engaged, and that is by spending a shorter amount of time on what you're saying, because it's harder for people to focus if you're not there in the room. And also, how can you engage them with things like sizzle reels and visuals and other ways to help support the story you're telling verbally. So, people would not go in pre working from home, pre Zoom, go in with, maybe there were some storyboards, maybe there were some printouts that they had, but they wouldn't go in with like a full presentation or a full deck or like a sizzle reel that they would show. It'd be much more of a conversation. Where now I've seen things like creating sizzle reels that they would show anywhere between like 1 to 3 minutes about the tone and the world of the show. It could be something that's created originally on their own, or it could be something that is edited together from other shows to show character archetypes and the tone of the show that they're going to pitch. A lot of decks where some it has like some text on it, others that it has absolutely no text, where it just shows character archetypes. Again, so you get a sense of, as you're talking about this character, you can kind of see who it is we're going for in terms of the archetype. Not saying we want to cast this exact person, but this is the character that we're going for. And I've seen plenty of shows get sold that had a sizzle and didn't. I've seen plenty of shows not get sold that had a sizzle or didn't. So there's no like real true formula to it. But I would say just the more engaging you can make your pitch, the better.
And that brings us to our next. Is there anything else that is a sort of special sauce other than what you've said, making compelling characters, making a compelling argument or pitch of yourself as an authentic creator and somebody who is a good hang? What else makes it successful, if anything? And what are the common ways it goes horribly wrong? And that might be specific to the setup or the tech in general.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, look, doing this working from home, it's important we have like reliable internet connections. I remember doing stuff very early on with CWR over Zoom. I think the first time I did like a Q&A with a couple of writers, they were writers from It's Always Sunny, and it was like the first time doing this. We were trying to build a community, and I think 10 minutes in, like my internet just cut out, and I saw on the Nextdoor app that like the internet was out all over the block, and that like when was the last time that happened? And of course, it hasn't happened since, but it happened right there in the moment when I was like, God help me. Can I like it? I'm trying to, piece this thing together, and the internet goes out, and that might happen.
Right.
That I think is much more forgivable. You could always reschedule a meeting. Hiccups with like a presentation and stuff like that's fine. People don't really expect perfection, but just make sure you have it rehearsed. And if something goes wrong, something goes wrong. You joke about it and you just get back into it.
Hmm.
But I think the other things that are less tech and internet focused have to do with the length of time that you're pitching your show. There's just a lot of times there's just way too much detail and over specificity of things that aren't relevant to the overarching like engine of the show of what the show is, and we get bogged down in too many details, and it's just hard for us to focus,
Hmm.
and people tune out and nobody really knows what the show is. So we have to really find that line between what is what's the headline, what's the sub headline, and then what is just enough detail and specificity to support that, to make us say, oh, okay, wow, I get that. They paint a full picture.
Hmm.
Perfect, let's move on. Right. So the amount of time, like pitches are scheduled for an hour time block. A pitch, you should never be talking for a full hour. 15 minutes might be ideal. um, and then like open it up to Q&A, so save some of that detail and specificity you have if questions come
Hmm.
about. So spending too much time on that and focusing too heavily on the plot, I think is a big one where we think plot points are important in terms of like and then he jumps out of a helicopter and he starts shooting them from behind with the guns, and I'm like, I don't know what that really means
Hmm.
unless you tell me about who this character is, why they're doing what they're doing, how they got there, sort of the emotional decisions that they're making. That's what's going to connect us, the listeners, to the story that you're telling us, because
Hmm.
we want to be able to relate as human beings. So if we can boil it down to that, it's more relatable. When we
Hmm.
get more into like the plot points and like these big, but like, oh, but the sister was alive the whole time. It's like, okay, that sounds good, I think. So really hone in on character and their human emotion and how we relate as opposed to the plot.
Hmm.
So those are two really big things.
Yeah, and not getting
Um,
yourself mired in when there's a lack of response. Oftentimes, people are listening, and they are listening and present, and they'll be quiet to be
mhm,
sure when you're done to engage or ask questions. But if you're sort of reading the room like they're not talking, I guess I should keep talking.
right.
That will unravel
Yeah.
quickly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I've seen that. Yeah, you've seen that. I've seen that a lot where
Yeah.
they feel like if no one's talking or asking questions, like that's a cue that I should just like keep telling them more and telling them more and telling them more. It's like, even though we're not there in person, like we still need to do quote unquote read the room, read the Zoom, which
Yes.
is like, it's okay to go in there with like a tight 15-minute pitch, in and out connection, the characters, what happens in the pilot, a little bit about the arc of the first season, like leave them wanting more,
Hmm.
leave us wanting to ask like more questions, and then be prepared to answer those questions, as opposed to just like going on and on and on and on and on and on, because some people like sit there and just absorb information and they're not like eager to jump in and ask questions. Doesn't mean they're not engaged, it just means
Right.
like that's their style.
Hmm.
So we don't need to take that as, I guess I'll just keep talking.
Right. Right. It is an energetic dialogue, if nothing else. Even if
Yes.
there's only nonverbal feedback coming back, you still have to be tuned in to what that is to know whether or
Yes.
not it's time to wrap it up and ask a
Yeah, and
question.
and look, a lot of we talked about these three things of being good on the page, being good in the room, which is the pitching aspect, and being good to work with. A lot of times you'll get 2 out of 3, because the good on the page and good in the room can be very, very hard strengths to have that are equal to one another. Meaning
Mhm.
a lot of times a very good writer might not necessarily be good, oftentimes is not that good at pitching or conveying their show verbally or telling a story in a very dramatic, compelling way. Like those are two very, very different skill sets. We're
Mhm.
talking about almost writing and performing. Again, two
Right.
very different skill sets. So, you know, if you have to read from the paper, that's fine. I've seen that all the time. But for me, I mean, if I'm listening, I'm engaged by somebody who seems like they're having a conversation with me, who seems interested in engaging me in the story and in the conversation, as opposed to reading from the page, which we can immediately pick up on. Right.
Right.
Um, that's not to say you have to sit there and memorize like every single word for word of your pitch. This way you're like, that's not it. I think you
Mhm.
just want to try to find a way to blend the good writing with the performance aspect and try to come off conversational, because that's when, the audience is going to feel most engaged.
Of course. Of course. We've all had that audition experience too, of those of us that are actors and creators where someone's eating a sandwich in the middle of it, phones ring, things like that. Everything's going to happen, and just the more practice you've had, the more open you'll be to moving
Yeah.
through those moments
Yeah,
of distress. And
absolutely.
you mentioned those pitch decks or proofs of concept. How do they come into play? Are you more likely to be going through that material before the appointment and having flipped through a pitch deck and asked questions about that? Or are you looking at it during the call? Does that vary?
Yeah, it can depend, I think, on, sometimes we'll get, like, it depends if we're looking at something that somebody wants to pitch to us. If we're going out with a pitch with this person, somebody could potentially send a deck, and we're like, okay, like this isn't, like we like the show, the deck isn't that great, so let's reformat it and redo it for when we take this pitch out to networks. um I will say this about decks: if you're sending it, I always like to think of decks in two different versions. Number one, you're sending it for people to look at and read and absorb your show if you are not there to verbally pitch it.
Hmm.
Meaning, if somebody asks for a deck via email, or if you're going to send it and you're not there to like walk them through the deck,
Hmm.
what is just enough text and specificity that we need on the deck to get people to open it and say, oh, okay, I understand what the show is. I get the feel, I
Hmm.
get the tone, I get the world, I get who the archetypes are. One of the biggest mistakes people make, and I see it all the time in decks, is just like huge chunks of text and like big paragraphs. And I'm like, the deck is supposed to be visual. And I'm like looking, I'm like, what does this mean? What does this read here?
Yeah.
Um, like just give like a headline, a bullet point, like what is the key phrase or information that you're trying to convey with this? Like more often
Hmm.
than not, people are gonna open it and skim through to get a sense of the tone, the world, the characters, and like, okay, is this like a type of genre show? Is it a comedy? Like that's really what it's for. And then
Hmm.
the other version of the deck is when you're there to help, when you are there to verbally pitch
Hmm.
and you're just using visuals. Like I'm trying to think, probably never put text on the screen when we're pitching a show verbally
Mm.
along with a deck, because you
Right.
want people to absorb the information you're giving them, and the visual is there to help support whatever it is you're saying.
Hmm.
We can only do the human brain can only do so many things at once. I can't like listen to you, look at the image, and then read the text and then absorb. Like,
Yeah.
are they three different things? Like, what am I supposed to be focused on? Right.
Hmm.
So just keep that in mind when it comes to decks.
Of course, having two separate decks, that's so smart. And also, are there specs for that? I don't feel like anyone talks about that. How long is the average pitch deck? Of course, it could be more complex for a certain show, but I've seen some that are 42 pages, and I don't know that you want to be looking through that, right?
Yeah, I mean yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, I don't know. So there is no like number. I would just
Right,
say always, always, always with all these materials and pitches, like the shorter the better, and the more
right,
concise the better.
right.
Just what is enough detail and specificity you need to highlight. Um, I, you know, I think you really want to try to convey with those visuals the tone, the world, and the character archetypes. I think those three
Mhm.
things are crucial when it comes to visuals.
Mhm.
What sort of your color scheme? Like, is it a dark and gritty show? Great. What, we're probably not going to use like bright colors and like bubble letters. That would be more
Right.
for like an animated or like a rom-com half-hour comedy, right? So
Yep.
um, I think making sure those things are in line as opposed to just like what the length should be. But I always caution the shorter the better. No,
Of
no one's
course.
flipping through 40 slides.
Err on the side of distilling it down to its most impactful nuggets of information, right?
Yes.
So I've gone in to pitch one particular script. There might be a scenario where you've already got a project like that that's cooking. So
Mhm.
should creators be prepared to discuss their other projects, and why might that happen?
And so are we referring to, let's say, going into like a net, excuse me, a network or a studio and saying, "Hey, here's my show. Like, I want you to buy it, and I want you to
Mhm.
make this with me."
Mhm.
And the intention is going in to pitch that show. Yeah.
Right. Right. That I've done all this work on my gem of a show, but what are the reasons why they might say, "What else is in your portfolio?" And should I be ready to talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, I will just say from my experience that that isn't really the case unless it's more of like a general meeting where we get a
Mhm.
sense of like, okay, what's your voice? What tone and style do you like to write in? What what shows are like, if there was any show that you could create, what would it be? Or a show from history that you would write on, what would it be? Um, when people are pitching things, usually it's that specific thing.
Mhm.
And in that moment for a pitch, usually it's not, hey, what else do you have?
Right.
Um, it can always be a follow-up in terms of, so to your first question, what's a reason why a studio or people might say no? It's because yes, they might have something too similar in development.
Mhm.
It could be, the show just didn't really resonate with them. Like, we can't forget that this is still an industry ran by human beings who sometimes have subjective opinions, and sometimes the show doesn't really work for them. That's
Mhm.
if somebody else were to take over and take that same pitch meeting, then maybe it works for them and they're ready to greenlight it, right? So
Mhm.
what I'm saying there is detaching from the results, just making sure you put the work in and putting together a compelling show that you love, that you would want to watch, that you're connected to, um, and then detach from whether or not other people like it.
Mm.
Because yes, that's the result we want, but really, at the end of the day, it's something that we can't necessarily control, right? So
Right.
I want to make sure people focus on that. But yes, maybe they have something similar in development. The show didn't resonate with them. The character, the emotional connection wasn't that clear. We couldn't really understand the characters, or why people would find these characters compelling. More often than not, that means they're not like three-dimensional enough. So these are
Mm.
these are reasons why we're kind of like, we don't know if this is for us.
Right.
Um, I will say, if that's an answer you get, then there's no harm in following up a little bit down the line, maybe even like a month later, and just say, "Hey, I have this other show that I'm ready to pitch." It's a
Mhm.
little like getting some feedback based on what they might have said for that first pitch. And if you have a show that's a little bit different in tone, or you think might be a better fit for them, like, just say, "Hey, I have another show for you."
Mhm.
But if that question were to come up, I mean, it would always be great to be prepared with, a couple of log lines of other shows that,
Mhm.
like that can't hurt, especially if they ask that question.
Of
But
course.
I've never seen someone ask that and then they go into like a whole nother pitch for like another show. It's like
Of
generally
course.
we're there to hear that one pitch for that one show.
Right. Just for context of who you are and what you're interested in, and the
Yes.
sort of wheelhouse of where your talent is, as opposed
Yes.
to, oh great, no, pitch us another 20 minutes. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Not
Yeah,
likely.
exactly. Because they can get a sense of, in that pitch, of who you are as a person, as a writer, as a creator,
Hmm.
and they might keep that door open and say, this one isn't for us, but come back to us if you have other ideas or other takes. That means they like you, which is great. That show just happened to not resonate with them, which is
Uh-huh.
okay. I mean, tons, thousands of shows get pitched and every year and get passed on, and
Hmm.
so you really have to think about it as, I'm not, this is my one end all be all. This pitch is going to make or break me. Like, that's not really the case. We want to get in the
Right.
habit of constantly coming up with ideas that could make for a compelling show. and then
Hmm.
figuring out how we could turn that into a pitch. And then, of course, we wanted to be something that we would enjoy working on and writing. I'm
Right.
just saying, like, sit there and just pump out shows, but
Hmm.
um, it can be a numbers game sometimes, and I don't want people to lose sight of that.
Of course. Of course. And what do creators need to know about the importance of IP right now in the industry?
So, I'd say anywhere between like 90 to 95% of things that are being made and sold right now are based on IP. And
Hmm.
for people who aren't familiar with that, IP stands for intellectual property. And
Hmm.
a simple example is the Marvel comics. All of the shows that we see on Disney Plus and all of the films that are based on Marvel characters is IP that Disney owns, that they then turn into these shows and uh, films. Another example that people don't really know is probably IP, but a couple years ago, Queen's Gambit, the limited on Netflix, was really popular. That was
Hmm.
based on a book that was written back in the 60s.
Hmm.
Nobody had ever heard about it, but it was still based on intellectual property. And that's
Right.
something that studios and networks like, because they tend to think that, well, there's probably a built-in audience somewhere. Somebody bought and read this book. We can promote that it's based on such and such, or it's based on a true story. Like, there's a number of different ways to market it. The fact that it was a material that already existed.
Hmm.
So there tends to be more trust. And I'm not sure if this is, the right recipe or not, but
Hmm.
the trend seems to be that there's more trust in a material that already existed in some way, shape, or form,
Right.
because there's some type of foundation for it. There's some
Yeah.
type of sort of blueprint already that you can use to adapt. So, uh, you know, that's why IP is really driving everything that we're seeing on TV. And that's why
Hmm.
people are seeing so many remakes and reboots, and why people are saying, why do people keep remaking and rebooting things? And it's like, well, the IP already existed and they feel like that's a safer bet. So
Right.
that's not to say originals will never get sold or never get made. Um, there's a pendulum always in this business, and the
Right.
pendulum is swung heavily to the side of IP right now. So
And is that only, may I ask, is that only books or comics? Does it apply to articles and editorials too?
it- so yes, it does apply to all of that.
Hmm.
The tricky part is that the larger the IP, the more editions sold, i.e., Harry Potter,
Hmm.
Twilight, Marvel, Batman, DC, all of those are already bought up by
Hmm.
the large corporations who own that IP. So I can't, or Nikki, you can't write a show about Batman and then go around town and pitch it, because
Right.
that's that IP is owned, and we just we can't do that as up and
Hmm.
coming artists. What we can do is, like you said, find a maybe an up and coming artist who is rolling out their own graphic novel, and you can partner with them and say, hey, I think this is really great work. I'd love to try to like pitch this and turn this into a TV show if you're open to it.
Hmm.
Find a book that really resonates with you, that is not right now number one on the New York Times bestseller list, but is something
Right.
like that Queen's Gambit book that again hits home for you. The author or the publisher hasn't done anything with it in terms of a film or a TV show. So if you were to reach out to them and say, hey, I have this idea, like, they're more often than not going to say like, all right, yeah, well, I mean, let's see where it goes,
Right.
right? If you're willing to put in the work on that. Yeah, or a biography or an article, um, any number of those things can get optioned and turned into a series.
Hmm.
One other thing I just want to say about IP is a thing that people kind of get hung up on, that I see quite a bit, is that um, separating sort of an event from more of like a world and a character. Meaning, if we see like an article that is about an event,
Hmm.
more often than not, that's going to be an idea better served for a feature or a limited series.
Uh-huh.
Think like Chernobyl as a limited, or think of um, I don't like if we're writing something that's about I have no idea.
Sure.
Like the creation of the Taj Mahal, right? Was like a
Right.
specific event about a specific thing. Like maybe that's better suited for a feature as opposed to who's the character and their journey that we can follow episode to episode and what's the engine of the show that can
Hmm.
take place over a number of seasons.
Right.
That more often than not is going to maybe need like a novel or something with a little bit more of a built out world or universe that you can use in terms of a show, maybe a series of books, something like that. Not
Hmm.
always the case, but a lot of times people will send me an article and say, this would make a great show. And I'm like, well, like it might make a great episode because it's about like a one specific thing or event. I don't know if
Hmm.
there's like an engine of a show and a series of characters here that we can base it on. So I
Right.
just want to make sure people think about that.
Of course. And there does need to be an arrangement on paper, an agreement to option said material to say, I have the right on behalf of this author to develop
Yes.
this story should it go forward, as
Yeah.
opposed to, oh, I read that thing and now I'm going to go pitch it. You
Yeah.
do have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
put it on paper.
Yeah, yeah, great point. I mean, and even if you personally don't own the rights to that book that that author wrote, there's still maybe an agreement that the two of you say, very simple and basic agreement that says, "Hey, I love this story. I have an idea for turning it into a TV show. Let's partner on this." And then this will give me leverage if I'm going to a studio or a network and say, hey, I have the person who wrote the book on board to
Hmm.
participate in a capacity of XYZ. Um, Meaning you don't have to pay out of pocket for the rights. Some people do, some writers and creators do.
Right.
But if you get the okay from the publisher, the author, whoever it is, whoever owns the rights, then more often than not, if the studio or network wants to move forward, then they will option the rights.
Right. Right. That makes perfect sense. And because the pandemic production has been so bottlenecked, right? We've had
Mhm,
so many people have been pitching all through the pandemic, and people
mhm.
at the top tiers, top levels have been pitching new shows. What are some of the potential pathways? What are some scenarios that could play out after a meeting with a creator who's totally new to you?
Um, we could. It really it depends on kind of what their goal is. So I think if their goal, really there are two things that we're always going to be doing as writers in this industry, and it's either staffing or developing,
Hmm.
right? So you're either going to be staffed on a show or you're going to be developing your own show. If we get somebody that comes in and pitches us a show that they want to develop and we're like, it's too similar, or we don't, we don't really get it. It's like, but we do like this person and we read their sample and it's really good. If staffing is an option for them or if they're open to it is a question we always ask, then we keep
Hmm.
them in mind for being staffed on somebody else's show,
Hmm.
especially if they are a newer creator, more up and coming creator. They could
Right.
have been writing for like 10 or 20 years. But what I mean by newer or up and coming is the credit and sort of their body of work in larger shows. So they could be a great writer, but the experience of running a show is very different. Like
Hmm.
I talk to showrunners all the time and always ask this question publicly so they can answer it to everybody who's joining
Yes.
is like, oh, do you just need to be a good writer to run your own show? Or is it realistic for a writer who wrote their first script to sell it and to run their own show? No, it's
Right.
not, because people don't want to invest millions and millions of dollars into someone who has really no experience handling, budgeting, and managing teams around millions and millions of dollars. So
Right.
it's one of those important questions: who's going to run this show, right? So
Hmm.
I say that because I see a lot of times I get writers who say, "This is my script. I want to run the show. I don't want to give it up. I don't want to give up creative control." And I'm just not sure how realistic that is,
Right.
because it's just like any other business or industry. i- It's really challenging unless you go off completely independent to go
Hmm.
from creating this first piece of work to the CEO running huge budgets and managing these big teams.
Right.
More often than not, you're going to have to go through the process and work your way up to that. Again, not to say it's impossible, but
Hmm.
even if you do want to build your own thing out, you're going to need somebody else to guide you and consult you and have a supervisor and somebody else help you run that show.
Right. Right. It's unfortunate. I do think if there is a gap in the knowledge of we don't get to take our precious idea that we made a series with for $50,000, even if it's a budget like that, which is not customary, to
Mhm.
then say, I'll be able to run $1 million one and I'll do all the writing myself. I don't need a writer's room. I'm also going to be the showrunner. And guess what? I'm going to star in it.
Yeah.
There
Yeah,
isn't time
that's
in the day to do all of that, first of all. And no one is going to give you that right out of the gate.
well, I would say this, if you are interested in doing that, go do it.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
and I say that very simply. It's not. It's
Yeah, go do
simple.
it.
It's not easy, but
Yeah.
go do it in terms of find somebody who believes in the idea, piece it together, get people to work on spec, give them
Hmm.
credits, find some money, shoot a YouTube show, and then you could say, and if it hits, you can say, well, I did all this myself. Great. Now
Hmm.
you have a track record, a proof of concept to get to
Right.
that next step, that next level. For some people, that's all they want to do is just create
Right.
like a YouTube channel and turn out their own stuff and not turn what they have into a TV show, which is totally fine.
Right.
Um, so it's just really finding like what works best for you.
And that scale is important, I think, like what you're talking about, is that Netflix is more likely to partner with a showrunner they've worked with before on something else if they
Mhm.
buy your idea, because they have a track record of knowing what that's going to look like as the seasons play out. And
Yeah,
it's a little bit different. So by all means, learn from those who have gone before.
yeah,
And
and definitely.
finally, there's one question that we have been loving to ask everybody's feedback on, which is, do you think that the major networks and streaming platforms are ready to begin buying indie TV shows directly from content creators?
Yeah. First of all, I love this question. And I love sort of thinking about this and trying to get our industry to pivot more into this.
Mhm.
Because if I think about just how many creators are out there that do want to create, but kind of get hung up by the process, or that there's
Mhm.
only so many people who can greenlight something, or only so many companies that can greenlight something, and that's tough for the creator because there's a lot more great work that could be put out there if people had the power to sort of greenlight their own stuff or produce their own things.
Mhm.
Um, I think it depends on what we're defining as indie TV shows. So let's talk about like a couple of different scenarios. We talked about the YouTube channel, so like creating your own web series, creating your own channel on YouTube or Vimeo that winds up taking off, and you're starting to build your own audience.
Mhm.
Then you're more likely to get a network, a studio, or a platform to buy from you because you already have a built-in audience, right? Like
Right.
you already have that IP that you own, that you exist, that you created, and you have a built-in audience. So it's easier for them to take that name, that audience, and transfer it to their platform
Right.
because they know people are going to tune in because people are already tuning in. So
Mhm.
there's that. So think about the idea of creating your own work and building an audience and building community around that, which is what's going to be really, really popular. We've seen it already, but even as we continue to go forward, this idea of this community that you build around you because people want to find their tribe, they want to find their community, and a lot of times if they're treated well, they would be very loyal to you as a member of that community.
Mhm.
um, so when there's strength in numbers like that, you can do things like crowdfunding and crowdsourcing and create your own things that don't have to rely so heavily on a network or a streaming platform.
Mhm.
um, some of the traditional models that have existed in this business for a while, like for example, the broadcast sitcom, right? Not saying it's completely dead, but we are seeing significantly less broadcast multicam sitcoms because
Mhm.
that's just not, our industry has pivoted away from the traditional advertising broadcast network commercials. Like people want to binge things, people don't want to watch commercials. So now it's more along the lines of, well, am I going to be on a platform where it's a no commercials, or where they have subscriptions where it's commercials, or you could buy another one where there's no there are a number of different things to think about around that.
Mhm.
um uh, but going back to this original question, I think yes. I mean, I think yes, they are ready to buy. I think some are doing it faster and better than others. I think some are more reluctant and still
Mhm.
sticking to the old school model of Hollywood of let's find like the established showrunner and the writer and the producer who has done so many things, and let's get them to try to sell a bunch of shows. But here's the problem: there's so many different streaming platforms, and those people with reps who demand a lot of money demand a lot of money. and it
Right.
gets very, very expensive. And certain, let's say, entities in the industry have a hard time playing under that model because of the price points. So
Hmm.
if there are things that we can do at a lower price point for our work as creators, that is also going to be better for us in the long run when it comes to networks and streamers wanting to buy our stuff. So a
Right.
number of different things to think about, but yes, I think the door is absolutely open. We hear this word influencer all the time. I kind of cringe a little bit when I hear it. It's like, what are we influencing people
Yeah.
to do exactly? But
Mm,
if people have that following and you're able to build something fun or funny or compelling or dramatic on your own that creates a community and an audience, then yes,
mhm.
there's a pathway for you to expand into a stream platform or you know to a wider audience with your show.
Of course. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for your perspective. We always love getting to chat with you and appreciate you being so generous with your time.
Yeah, of course, it's always fun.
Brought to you by the Catalyst Story Institute.